So here we have it, everybody, the all-new 15-inch M2 MacBook Air, and as you can see, I decided to get it in the midnight blue colorway because with my 13-inch M2 MacBook Air, it's in the same color, so I figured let me show you how it wears and tears over time because I've had that M2 MacBook Air since day one. So in this video, what I want to do is compare both of these devices. For all intents and purposes, the internals are pretty much the same, but I want to go over the hardware differences, if there are any aside from the screen size, as well as what that screen resolution and that screen size gets you from a software standpoint. So without further ado, let's get into this comparison. Now, I quickly wanted to do the unboxing for you guys, but this is very similar to what we have with every new MacBook computer. You get the MacBook itself in the box. I did go with the actual baseline model because it shipped the fastest. Whether or not I keep this baseline model versus something that's more upgraded like a 16 gig RAM version, that's yet to be seen. But again, this is the 15-inch baseline model and it comes with the MacBook in the box, as well as that nice braided cable that does match the actual colorway of the computer, aside from the part that actually plugs into the power, which is kind of weird. I don't know, Apple's continuing to do that. And then also we have the actual power brick. Now this is new because when you do check out, you actually have two options and they don't actually charge you extra for it. The first option is a dual 35-watt USB-C charger, and then you also have the option to switch that for no additional cost to a one-port 70-watt charger to charge this up at max speed. Now, Apple's letting you decide what you want to do with that power adapter because if you have a 65-watt power adapter or higher, so that includes that 70-watt adapter, you do have the capability of fast charging the M2 MacBook Air, whether it is the 13-inch or the 15-inch. There's nothing written on the website saying how much actual wattage the MacBook Air can take in at one time, but it does say that with this fast charging, you can charge in 30 minutes up to 50%, so that is what Apple's calling fast charging, but what that means from an actual technicality standpoint, we still don't know. But now we got the unboxing out of the way, what I do want to talk about is pricing of both of these laptops, because when the M2 MacBook Air, the 13-inch variant came out, it actually started at $1299. But what's interesting now about the lineup is that with the release of the 15-inch MacBook Air, it actually slotted at that same $1299 price point and then slotted the M2 MacBook Air 13-inch variant to $1099, which in my opinion is an absolute great price for that model. Again, we're now talking about baseline models with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, and then Apple still decided to keep the M1 MacBook Air, which is still a great value for $999. And now for those people in the US especially, I can only vouch for the US, you can actually get this $100 off through the education store. And again, there's no verification process. You don't need to show a student ID or a teacher ID. It's just $100 off, and you can still trade in anything previous for these MacBooks through the education store. So something to take note of if you want to save $100 on your purchase of one of these MacBooks, which makes it even a better value in my opinion. So now let's start comparing the actual hardware of these two devices because, again, the first thing you see is going to be the size of this MacBook. And from the size, it was actually much bigger than expected when I actually held it in the hand. I've been so used to that 13.6-inch display, that form factor, that footprint, so that when I picked this up, it felt a little bit heavy in the hand compared to the M2 MacBook Air and the 13 inches. Because the 13-inch MacBook Air sits at about 2.7 pounds, versus the M2 MacBook Air and the 15-inch variant sits at 3.3 pounds. So only about a 0.6 pound difference overall, but you do feel it in the weight, but it is nicely dispersed along the entire footprint because it is a much bigger footprint of a device. You're getting an additional inch in depth and about 1.5 inches in width when it comes to the actual footprint of this device. From a thickness standpoint, you do actually increase the thickness just a tad bit, about 1 to 2 millimeters. So it's not really a big difference from a thickness standpoint, but you do see it from a footprint standpoint, obviously, because now we're going from a 13.6-inch display to a 15.3-inch display. And if we continue with the hardware differences, you do notice that the actual trackpad is much bigger on the 15-inch MacBook Air compared to the 13-inch MacBook Air. Why they did this, they probably did it just for aesthetic and visual reasons, so it doesn't look kind of awkward by having a smaller trackpad, but it doesn't add any additional functionality. I mean, you get more real estate on your trackpad, which is always great. You know, these trackpads are amazing in their own right, but it doesn't add any extra functionality. There's nothing that you can kind of extend further. You can just get a little bit more travel when you go from one end to the other, but you can also mimic that travel by increasing the trackpad speed on the smaller 13-inch MacBook Air if you really want to get some extra kind of mouse travel or clickable travel through that. And then outside of the weight and the size and that trackpad, the only other actual difference in the hardware is that we went from 4 speakers to now 6 speakers. And I want to play you a sample of some music because they do actually make a decent difference. And one thing that you do notice for those of you that are using MacBook Pros or have used MacBook Pros for a long time is that normally with the space on the left and right of the keyboard on those larger 15-inch, so the 14 and the 16-inch MacBook Pros, the speaker grills are there. But Apple decided to not actually use speaker grills where they normally are on those MacBook Pros and keep it behind the keyboard on the hinge of the actual device, which is what they do with the M2 MacBook Air with the 13-inch one. So it does look a little bit strange not seeing those grills there from a visual standpoint, but you get used to it pretty quickly. But aside from the trackpad being a little bit bigger and the actual sound being a little bit punchier and a little bit louder overall, and the screen obviously being bigger, for all intents and purposes, this machine is identical, right? The footprint of the keyboard is the same. Touch ID, the speed of Touch ID is exactly the same as well. I tested that. It's the same Touch ID technology. Even though the bezel might seem a little bit thinner than the actual bezel on the other MacBook Air, they're identical. It just seems a little bit thinner because you get more screen overall, but the notch is exactly the same in terms of size. You get the same 1080p webcam, which is fine in its own right. You still get the same software. You get the same kind of tactile design on the keyboard, the chiclet style. You still get that unibody design overall. It's the same exact hue of midnight blue. And yes, it's still going to be a fingerprint magnet overall. If you guys can see from my older MacBook Air, the M2 version, I didn't clean it at all just to show you guys what it looks like on a real day-to-day basis. And it's full of fingerprints and full of smudges. And this 15-inch MacBook Air is going to have the same thing. And also I want to show you guys on the sides where you actually get the I.O. You can actually notice with my M2 MacBook Air, the smaller 13-inch one that I've had since launch, which is what people complained about in the very beginning. But to keep going on that side, you still get the same exact I.O. You get two Thunderbolt 4 ports, you get your MagSafe charger, and then on the other side, you do get the headphone jack. And then on the bottom, you still get your 4 little feet with the little rubberized material, which is great for stability. On the bottom of my 13-inch MacBook Air, I have a MOF stand, which I keep on there at all times. Also, I'll link that down below if you guys want to check it out. But from an actual hardware standpoint, everything is exactly the same. The internals are the same. The baseline models bring the same amount of storage from a RAM perspective and a hard drive perspective. So at the end of the day, you're pretty much paying an extra $200 for an extra 1.5 to 2 inches of screen real estate between these MacBook Airs. But now what I want to quickly do is show you what that extra 2 inches or that going from 13.6 to 15.3 gives you when it comes to actually using the computer itself, right? So obviously these are content consumption machines. You can edit a little bit on it. Like I'm not going to edit a bunch of layers of 4K or 8K, anything like that. But if you want to do like a short, maybe a 30-second short that's in 1080p or even 4K, you can use iMovie or Final Cut Pro, and it's going to get the job done for the most part. I would recommend maybe going to the 16 gig RAM variant, but even at the 8 gig version, it's going to work well. But what I wanted to show you guys is what you get additionally from a visual standpoint, right? So what I wanted to show off was I opened ESPN in Chrome on both of the computers. I made sure that the focus or the zoom was at 100% for both of them. I went on full screen, and then you can see that you get a little bit more data on the screen on the 15-inch MacBook Air versus the 13, right? On the bottom left, you can see that you have a couple more tabs versus on the bottom left of the smaller MacBook, it stops at that ESPN-W. So you do get a little bit more visually in terms of what you can fit on the screen than you would on the 15-inch MacBook Air. But that makes total sense because the screen resolution goes from 2560 by 1664 to 2880 by 1864. So you get a few more pixels in there that are going to add up to more, right? I did the same thing with an ESPN article. You can see that you get maybe 4 or 5 additional lines of text before it actually gets cut off on the larger screen. So that is what you're dealing with. So that means you're probably going to get longer timelines if you are editing, right? If you're a journalist and you're writing inside of WordPress, you'll get an additional couple lines in there before you actually have to scroll down. So if that's important to you and you want to be able to fit more in there without having to kind of minimize and go to 90 or 75% in terms of what you're seeing, then this could work out and this could be the solution that you want for that additional $200. But the actual tech of the screen is the same. They both go to 500 nits of brightness. They're both that liquid retina display. They both give you the P3 color gamut. They both give you True Tone tech. And you can see with the video that I'm playing from our new host from 9 to 5 Google, obviously it's a bigger screen, so it's a little bit more immersive when you're watching video, which, you know, I'm all for. So at the end of the day, what are you paying for, right? You can go from $1099, which is, again, a great price for an M2 MacBook Air, to $1299 for the M2 15-inch MacBook Air. You're going from 13.6 to 15.3 inches in screen real estate. You get some additional pixels. You get 2 extra speakers for some extra depth, some extra bass, and some extra loudness. You also get a bigger trackpad for some more trackpad real estate. So if those things are important to you and you already have an M2 MacBook Air and you want to trade in your MacBook Air, which you get decent value for, you're not going to get the full value, of course, but again, $200 extra, you can go from the 13-inch to the 15-inch MacBook Air. But now, if you're somebody that wants to spec it up a little bit, then you're going to get into that 14-inch MacBook Pro territory, which sits at $2,000. So for instance, if I start with the baseline model, it starts at $12.99. I want to get 16 gigs of memory, 512 gigs of storage. I'm not sitting at $16.99. So I mean, I could take $100 off through the education store, but for $300 extra, then you get to the M2 Pro chip, which gives you a lot more power. So again, Apple does this on purpose to make you want to continue to buy up their hierarchy ladder of laptops and iPads and iPhones, because they're like, oh, for a little bit more, I can get that much more. But this 15-inch MacBook Air is going to be a mainstay. It's going to replace the 13-inch MacBook Air for me, because I'm a big believer in extra screen real estate, and for $200, for me, it's a no-brainer. For some others, you might have to think about it, but I will be going with 16 gigs of RAM, and I'm going to stick with the 256 gigs of storage because I use iCloud for most of this stuff. And again, my M2 MacBook Air is still a MacBook Air at heart, which means this is for web browsing, for email, for Slacks, for notifications, for managing schedules, for calendar stuff, for to-do lists, for things that aren't super intensive like video editing or programming or developing games, right? If you're going to get into that territory, move to a much more powerful M2 Pro, M2 Max, or even the M2 Ultra MacBooks, which are out there. But that is going to do it for this video, everybody. If you did enjoy, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And leave some comments down below about what you think. I think the 15-inch MacBook Air is a no-brainer for a lot of people that want extra screen real estate. And now we know that most people want a cheaper 15-inch MacBook Air. And that was the issue, right? When somebody wanted a bigger MacBook, they were immediately brought to a $2,500 MacBook Pro, which not a lot of people need all that power. Most people just need their email to work, their messaging app to work, their Slack to work, their Microsoft Teams to work. They need to be able to video chat. So this can do all that and then some, and you're gonna get a lot of headway with that M2 chip overall. But as I said, leave some comments down below of what you think of this new addition to the lineup. I'm happy overall because it's a win-win for everybody. It lowers the price of the current M2 13-inch MacBook Air. It gives you a nice option at the $12.99 price point. And again, Apple's lineup is looking better and better from a MacBook perspective. I mean, it's probably the best we've had in a very long time. But that's going to do it, everybody. If you guys want to watch more coverage, definitely say subscribe, because we're going to be doing some accessory videos, some 1 week, some 2 week later stuff. I'm going to kind of walk you guys through my experience with this laptop on a day in the life. So definitely say subscribe. And if you want to watch some more macOS, iOS, or iPadOS content, click on one of these videos right here. But until next time, I'm Fernando. I'm out of here, everybody. This thing's a beast. Peace.